No one dared speak to the Millionaire CEO, not the staff, not his partners, not even his doctors. But everything changed the day a housekeeper's daughter found him alone and silently wiped away his tear. She didn't ask questions. She didn't offer advice. Just a simple touch, and everything began to shift. What could a child possibly give to a man who had everything except peace? Stay with us as we unravel the story of an unexpected bond, the walls it breaks, and the home it builds. Because sometimes the smallest hands leave the deepest mark. The rain lashed against the tall windows of the Cole estate as Ethan returned from the city, his body hollow with the weight of the doctor's verdict. He had driven home without the radio, without the usual hum of distraction, and with only the sound of his own shallow breathing to accompany him. The words inoperable and advanced still echoed louder than any storm could, as if the oncologist had etched them across the surface of Ethan's mind with a scalpel. He had nodded, thanked the doctor, declined the follow-up pamphlet, and walked out with the straight posture and cold composure expected of a man with buildings named after him. Now, standing inside the foyer of a house too large for one person and too empty for any comfort, he peeled off his coat with mechanical precision. Each movement felt heavy, deliberate, rehearsed. He didn't look at his reflection in the hallway mirror. He had nothing left in himself he wanted to see. As he ascended the staircase, the scent of lemon polish and linen rose faintly from the banister, a meaningless detail, but something he clung to, if only to keep from unraveling completely. He reached his study without turning on any lights, dropped his briefcase beside the old armchair he rarely used, and sat with the weight of everything he hadn't said to anyone. He wasn't sure how long he stayed there, maybe 5 minutes, maybe an hour, but the storm outside had become background noise. The house no longer intimidated him. It simply reflected what he felt, grand, functional, and utterly void. Ethan loosened his tie, then discarded it altogether, his fingers trembling more than he liked. He stared at the wall across from him, where a portrait of his parents hung, stoic, perfect, dead. The silence felt engineered to suffocate. It wasn't just the diagnosis. It was the cruel reminder that he had no one he could tell, no wife to fall into, no siblings to absorb the shock. Friends had become clients. Clients had become ghosts. All that remained was this house and the money he had accumulated like armor. He hadn't cried at the hospital, hadn't blinked on the drive home, but now in the half-dark, he felt the single tear slide down his face, uninvited, like a betrayal. He closed his eyes, angry at the weakness, and told himself it was nothing, just fatigue, just dust. He had almost convinced himself. Convinced. Until the sound of soft footsteps reached the doorway. He looked up in time to see her, Emily, standing barefoot in the hallway, her little hand curled around a crumpled tissue, as if she had been holding it for hours, unsure of when to use it. Her nightgown was slightly oversized, the hem brushing against her shins, and her curly hair was flattened on one side where sleep had molded it. Ethan's first instinct was to straighten his posture, to wipe his face and recover the mask he wore so well. But she'd already seen it. She didn't gasp or speak immediately. Instead, she stepped into the room, the way someone would enter a space sacred with silence, and approached him with the solemnity of someone much older than 8. Her eyes weren't wide with fear or confusion. They held something softer, something he couldn't quite name. She didn't ask why he was crying. She didn't even ask if he was okay. She simply reached up, standing on her toes, and touched the tear still clinging to the edge of his cheek. Her hand was warm and tentative, not wiping it away so much as acknowledging it. The contact froze him more than any diagnosis had. "You're supposed to let the bad feelings leave," she said, her voice barely more than a whisper. "That's what Mommy says." Ethan didn't know how to respond. Her words had bypassed the part of him that handled business deals, that negotiated mergers, that crafted legal defenses like armor. He'd faced investors and courtrooms and foreign governments, but he suddenly found himself undone by a child's wisdom. Emily didn't smile when she said it. There was no performance in her eyes, no attempt to cheer him up. It was simply the truth, passed down through Maggie, absorbed without question, and now offered back to him like a gift. Ethan could see the fine lines of sleep around her eyes and realized she hadn't come because she'd heard something. She had come because she'd felt something. Perhaps children knew these things the way animals sensed storms. Maybe grief had a scent, and maybe Emily had followed it to him. Her hand lingered for a moment, then fell away slowly, as if she knew not to rush this fragile space they had entered together. He didn't speak for a while, not because he didn't have the words, he had plenty, but because he didn't trust any of them. Words failed in moments like this. They diminished things. He watched her as she sat down cross-legged on the rug beside him, not asking to be invited, not needing permission. She pulled her knees to her chest, resting her cheek on them, her tissue still balled in her hand, and they sat like that, two people separated by decades, and yet, in that moment, equally bare. Ethan had spent a lifetime perfecting his defenses, learning which smiles masked discomfort, which nods ended conversations, which silences created space without inviting closeness. But now, in the presence of this small, quiet girl, those tools felt laughably inadequate. She had seen the tear. Not just seen it, honored it. And somehow, by doing nothing more than being still and present, she had given him the smallest permission to grieve. He glanced at her again, and something unfamiliar tightened in his chest. Not pain, not fear, something closer to awe. When had anyone last sat beside him without needing something in return? No transaction. No leverage, just company. He thought about Maggie, who had worked in the house for a little over a year, always polite, never overstepping. She had mentioned her daughter's sensitivity once, a passing comment about Emily being old-souled, but Ethan hadn't paid it much attention. Now he wondered if that was Maggie's way of saying that Emily saw things most people missed, or perhaps things most people deliberately avoided. He exhaled through his nose, a shaky breath, and leaned back in the chair. The tear had long since dried, but the mark it left lingered. It wasn't the tear itself that mattered, it was that he hadn't been alone when it fell. Emily blinked slowly, her gaze drifting toward the ceiling. "Do you miss somebody?" she asked. The question was simple, but it sliced through him like glass. He nodded. That was all he could do. There were too many people to name, and yet none of them had mattered until now. Not like this. He thought about his sister, about the time she played Chopin with her eyes closed in the West Wing. He thought about his mother, who had once called him her little lion, a name he had grown out of far too fast. He thought about his father's funeral, and how he hadn't cried then either. Maybe he hadn't allowed himself to feel anything deeply since. But now, with this girl beside him and her mother's words echoing in his head, he wondered if grief was less about mourning the past and more about finally allowing yourself to be seen in the present. Emily didn't press for details. She didn't need to. Her question was enough. Ethan cleared his throat, suddenly aware of how long it had been since he had shared a moment with someone that wasn't built on expectation or necessity. In that quiet, Ethan felt the first crack in the wall he'd built around himself. It wasn't a dramatic collapse, just a subtle shift, a loosening, a breath, the faintest sound of stone giving way. Maybe it was enough. Maybe that was all it took to start again, to not be entirely consumed by what lay ahead. He knew the road would be hard. There would be hospitals, treatments, days when he would feel like a ghost of the man he once was. But now, at least, he had this moment, and he had her. He would never forget the softness of her voice, the gentleness of her hand, and the truth in her eyes. She had entered his silence not to fix it, but to share it. He could not have asked for more. As she rested her head on her knees and closed her eyes again, Ethan stayed still, letting the moment hold them both. And though he didn't know it yet, that single tear, wiped away by a child's hand, would be the beginning of everything that came after. A week after the doctor's verdict, sleep became elusive for Ethan. He had tried everything, reading financial reports, replaying old podcasts, even a glass of wine, but nothing dulled the unrest sitting in his chest. The house was too quiet at night. That silence used to feel like control. Now it just echoed back the noise in his head. So, somewhere between 3 and 4 a.m., barefoot and drawn, he gave up. He left the bedroom and wandered down the hallway, half expecting the kitchen to be dark and still. But when he turned the corner, light spilled into the hallway from under the door. A low murmur of voices and the occasional clatter of utensils broke the quiet. Curiosity replaced hesitation. He stepped inside and froze at the sight of Emily standing on a stool, flipping pancakes beside her mother, who looked as surprised to see Ethan as he was to see them. Emily, hair sticking up in places, was humming softly between giggles. Her pajama sleeves were rolled up and batter dotted her cheek. Maggie's eyes flicked to Ethan with a mixture of apology and amusement, as if caught in a harmless secret. "I thought I was the only one awake," Ethan said, his voice still rough from a night without sleep. Maggie smiled and offered a gentle shrug. "Emily woke up hungry. She gets these random cravings at odd hours. Pancakes this time. Figured we'd prep some for tomorrow while we were at it." Emily turned around proudly, holding up a lopsided pancake like it was a trophy. "I made this one. It looks like Australia." Ethan blinked, then actually smiled, caught off guard by the genuine absurdity of the observation. There was a chair tucked under the small kitchen table. Maggie gestured toward it without formality, and he hesitated, not because he didn't want to sit, but because he didn't know how to, not in this version of his house. He was used to catered breakfasts, perfect tables, no clutter. But this scene, the casual mess, the playful banter, the smell of butter and something sweet, it felt like a room from someone else's life. Still, he sat. He placed his hands on the table and tried not to look like a guest in his own home. Emily resumed her flipping, glancing at him occasionally, as if assessing whether he truly belonged there or not. "This is your third pancake phase this month," Maggie teased, handing her daughter a clean plate. "Pancakes are never a phase," Emily said, utterly serious. "They're a lifestyle." Ethan let out a dry chuckle, and Maggie looked at him with a raised brow, surprised. He couldn't blame her. He was surprised too. Sitting at that kitchen table, watching flour dust the air, listening to a child argue the existential importance of breakfast food was the furthest thing from what he had expected when he got up. Maggie moved with a casual rhythm that made Ethan think she had done this many times. Late-night cooking, conversations with half-asleep children, balancing the quiet needs of motherhood with the constant thrum of responsibility. Her hair was in a messy bun, and her sweatshirt had a faded band logo on it. She didn't seem like someone working in a mansion. She seemed like someone at home. Emily jumped off the stool and came over to the table with a new plate of pancakes, sliding them toward Ethan with both hands. "You can have these. They're not burnt. The first ones always are. It's a rule." He looked down at the plate and then back up at her. "You made these?" "Mostly me," she said. "Mom helped with the hot part." Something shifted again, as subtle and precise as the moment a note goes from dissonant to harmonic. Ethan picked up a fork, still unsure if he was doing it right, being here, partaking in this unplanned ritual. But he took a bite. Warm, sweet, imperfect, and it tasted like something real. He chewed slowly, nodding with real approval. "These are good," he said. Emily's eyes lit up and she beamed as if he'd handed her a gold medal. Maggie turned back to the stove, letting them have the moment. Ethan hadn't shared a table like this since. He couldn't remember. Even before his parents died, their meals were formal, orchestrated things. Then came college, then corporate ladders, and later dinners with expensive wine and people who pretended to listen. No one ever laughed. No one ever got batter on their shirt. And no one, not once, ever asked if he liked pancakes. Maggie eventually sat across from him, sipping tea from a chipped mug. "You okay?" she asked gently, not prying, just offering. He paused, not because the answer was complicated, but because he wasn't used to people asking without an agenda. "No," he said honestly, "but this helps." It was the first time he admitted that out loud. Maggie nodded slowly. "You don't have to talk if you're not ready," she said. "But you're welcome here, even if it's 3 in the morning." He didn't respond right away, but something in his shoulders softened. Emily had moved on to drawing faces in the steam on the window, humming again, unconcerned with adult sadness. The kitchen, with its cluttered counters and mix-matched dishes, felt more like home than any room Ethan had inhabited in years. And it had nothing to do with the house itself. It was the people in it. He realized then that comfort wasn't found in marble countertops or catered meals. It was found in the casual generosity of someone flipping pancakes because their child couldn't sleep. It was found in being offered a seat without explanation. "I might come back down tomorrow," Ethan murmured. Maggie smiled into her tea. "You'd be welcome then too." The rest of the night passed without drama. No deep revelations, no emotional collapse, just the occasional exchange of quiet words, the scent of syrup lingering in the air, and Emily eventually curling up on the bench by the wall, dozing with her head on her mother's lap. Ethan stayed longer than he needed to, sipping tea he hadn't asked for, letting the hum of domestic life surround him. He wasn't part of it, not yet, but he wasn't entirely outside of it either. Something about that struck him as enough for now. He looked around at the space, the chipped tiles, the handwritten grocery list on the fridge, the child-sized socks on the floor near the doorway. These things would have annoyed him once, reminders of disorder. But now they felt like signs of life, things that breathed. The idea that someone could just walk into a kitchen and be offered a meal without having to earn it, it was foreign, but not unwelcome. It was the first time in years he stayed in a room simply because it felt good to be there. He hadn't meant to go there. The west wing of the estate had been closed off for years, locked not by necessity, but by emotion. Since inheriting the mansion, Ethan had kept that section of the house untouched. Even the cleaning staff knew to avoid it. He had once instructed a contractor to replace a faulty lock there, but made sure the key was never used again. Yet now, on a quiet afternoon when he found himself walking without direction, he turned down the corridor leading to that long-forgotten part of the house. His hand hesitated on the doorknob. Dust had collected in the grooves of the wood, and the keyhole showed signs of time's indifference. Still, he pushed it open. The hinges protested slightly, but the door gave way. The air inside was stale, untouched by circulation, and he was surprised by how quickly the past rose to meet him. As he stepped over the threshold, the memories weren't vague. They were sharp, immediate. His sister's laugh echoed in his mind, uninvited. Her voice singing scales, correcting her own notes, playing too fast then too slow, just to annoy their tutor. That room had belonged to her more than anyone. Ethan didn't immediately see Emily. He thought he was alone at first, until he noticed the faint sound, barely music, not quite a melody, more like the whisper of contact coming from deeper inside. As he rounded the corner, he found her there, in front of the piano. Her fingers were gliding over the dusty keys, not pressing them hard enough to make a sound, just tracing the surface, mapping the layout like someone reading Braille. She didn't look up when he entered. Instead, she kept moving her fingers across the keys, then paused, then started again, as if expecting something to awaken. When she finally turned to him, her eyes were calm, not startled. "This piano doesn't work anymore," she said simply. Ethan stepped closer, the smell of old varnish mixing with forgotten time. "It's just out of tune," he replied, "and probably hasn't been played in a decade." Emily looked back at the keys and pressed one slowly this time. A low, dull note rang out, tired but not entirely dead. "Do you know how to play?" she asked, turning toward him again with genuine curiosity. Ethan shook his head. "No, my sister did. She played every day. She was the reason this room was ever open." Emily nodded as if this made perfect sense, then went back to touching the keys. "Every house should have music," she said, more to herself than to him. "Otherwise, it feels too sad." Ethan didn't respond at first. He was watching her, but more than that, he was feeling something stir in him, something uncomfortable, but not entirely painful. He thought of how his sister used to demand silence from the entire house when she was learning a new piece, how she would yell at him if he made noise outside her door. He had hated it at the time, but now the memory was precious. Music had once filled this house, and when she died, he had silenced it entirely, locked it away like a wound best left untreated. But here was Emily, unaware of all that, saying things that unlocked places he had intentionally buried. Her voice, innocent and unfiltered, did more to disarm him than any therapy session ever could. "Was she older than you?" Emily asked suddenly, hopping off the bench to stand beside him. "Yeah," he said after a pause. 2 years. She used to play classical music, Mozart, Chopin, even jazz when she felt rebellious. I never paid attention. I just wanted her to stop making noise." He gave a humorless chuckle. "Funny how you miss the things that used to annoy you." Emily didn't laugh. She looked at him with a thoughtful expression, her head tilted slightly, the way children often do when deciding how much truth to speak. "Maybe you didn't hate the noise. Maybe you just didn't know what to do with it yet." That struck him in a way he hadn't expected. It wasn't that Emily was wise beyond her years, though she was. It was that she said things without judgment, without performance. She wasn't trying to impress him or fix him. She was simply reflecting back what she saw, and what she saw, somehow, was the thing he had tried to pretend wasn't there. The ache, the guilt, the fact that he had closed the West Wing not just because it reminded him of his sister, but because he didn't feel worthy of remembering her. She returned to the piano and pressed another key. This one worked a little better, a higher tone, slightly sharp, but more alive than the last. "It's not broken," she announced, "just quiet." Ethan watched her hands move, and in them he saw echoes. Not replicas of his sister. Emily's movements were different, more tentative, but the spirit was there. The curiosity, the invitation. She wasn't asking him to remember his sister directly, but she was reintroducing him to what the house used to be when it was full of life. He sat down on a nearby armchair, the one with faded upholstery that hadn't been used since the funeral. He let his elbows rest on his knees, leaned forward and said, almost reluctantly, "She used to play this one song on rainy days, over and over. I never knew the name, but I remember the rhythm." Emily perked up. "Can you hum it?" He hesitated, then shook his head. "No, I wouldn't do it justice." Emily didn't press. She just nodded and went back to pressing individual notes, as if testing the piano's memory key by key. Minutes passed like that. No conversation, just quiet presence. Ethan didn't know how long he sat there. The West Wing didn't feel as heavy anymore, not with Emily there. And not just because she was a child, but because she wasn't afraid of the dust or the silence. She didn't treat the room like a tomb. She treated it like a room that was waiting to be used again. Maggie would probably scold her later for wandering off, but Ethan didn't care. In fact, he was grateful. No one else had dared come in here in years. And now here she was, exploring it like a place that still mattered. He leaned back, closing his eyes briefly, letting himself breathe in that neglected air, not with sadness this time, but with consideration. For the first time in ages, he wondered what it would be like to hear music in this house again, not through speakers, not through staged events, but real music. born from fingers and keys and emotion. And that thought alone was enough to stir something he hadn't felt in a very long time. Longing. Emily stood up again, brushing off her pajama pants like she had completed some important job. "If you want," she said, looking up at him, "I can learn to play. Then the house won't be sad anymore." It wasn't a question. It was a promise. Ethan looked at her, and something inside him softened, not in a fragile way, but in a way that suggested movement after long stillness. He nodded slowly, unable to say more because the lump in his throat wouldn't let him. Emily smiled like it was settled, then skipped toward the hallway, pausing only once to look back at the piano, as if making sure it knew she'd be back. Ethan didn't follow her immediately. He stayed seated, looking at the piano bench, the dust disturbed by her small fingers. The room wasn't healed, it wasn't even clean, but it had been entered again. It had been seen. And maybe that was the first step. He stood up at last, walked to the door, and before leaving, placed his hand on the edge of the piano for just a moment. It felt warmer than he remembered. Wandering the west wing of his mansion, a section he had locked away since inheriting it, Ethan found Emily tracing her fingers along the dusty piano keys. She asked if he knew how to play. He didn't, but he remembered his sister, long gone, who once filled that room with music. Emily's insistence that every house needs music stirred memories Ethan had buried deep, and for the first time, he considered opening that wing again. Maggie was trimming the rose bushes near the back hedges when Ethan's phone buzzed in his pocket. He was halfway through helping her reposition the stone planters that lined the path, a task he hadn't done in years, if ever, when he saw the name flash across the screen. Dr. Naylor. His stomach tightened, fingers suddenly clammy, despite the early warmth of the afternoon. He stepped away instinctively, muttering something vague about taking the call. Maggie nodded, but didn't look up from her pruning. He walked down the curved gravel path, passing under the old trellis that hadn't held up any flowers in years, until he reached the edge of the yard where no one could hear him. Or so he thought. He pressed the phone to his ear and tried to control his breath. The voice on the other end was calm, clinical but not cold. Words like aggressive and additional spread threaded through the conversation like poisoned thread. Ethan felt the world begin to constrict again. His replies were short, sometimes delayed, each one an effort to keep composure. Understood. Yes. How long? And after that? The doctor spoke of new treatments, of options that weren't quite options, and finally, of time frames no longer considered generous. He turned slightly, trying to face away from the house, from the garden, from everything, but he wasn't fast enough. As he ended the call, still gripping the phone like it had betrayed him, he heard the unmistakable crunch of small footsteps on gravel. He looked over his shoulder and saw Emily, standing a few feet away. She wasn't running or playing, or even curious in that fidgety way children often were. She just stood there, still, watching him with quiet eyes that were far too knowing. He had no idea how long she'd been there, long enough probably. Her expression wasn't frightened. It was observant, gentle, the kind of look adults forgot how to give. He opened his mouth, unsure whether to reassure her or lie or both, but she didn't give him the chance. She stepped forward, her gaze never leaving his face. "You're sick," she said, not as an accusation or question, but as if she were stating something as obvious as the sky being blue. Ethan swallowed hard. The instinct to deny it was there, but something stronger stopped him. Maybe it was the weight of the call. Maybe it was the way she didn't look away. He didn't respond, not because he didn't want to, but because there was nothing to say that would make sense to her. Cancer didn't make sense to him, and he had a dozen specialists explaining it. Emily didn't wait for an answer. She reached into the pocket of her shorts and pulled out something delicate, a dandelion, half its fluff still intact, its stem bent near the bottom. She held it in front of her like a sacred offering. Ethan stared at it, uncertain, and then slowly, without speaking, she walked up and placed it in his hand. Her fingers closed his around it gently. "This is for wishing the sickness away," she said. There was no theatricality to it, no magical belief. She wasn't pretending the dandelion was medicine or that blowing on it would fix everything, but it was something, a gesture that didn't come from logic or fear or obligation, just care, and for some reason, that felt like more than enough. Ethan looked down at the fragile stem in his palm and tried to understand why it suddenly felt heavier than his entire diagnosis. He crouched down so they were eye level, still holding the dandelion like it might vanish if he moved too fast. "Thank you," he said, voice uneven. Emily just nodded, as if nothing more needed to be said. She didn't ask when he got sick or what would happen next. She didn't press him for the kind of information adults demanded when they didn't know how to process emotion. She just stayed there with him, present. He felt something shift, some unnameable thing in his chest that had locked itself away the day of the diagnosis. And now, this little girl had simply stood beside him and opened it without even trying. He wondered briefly if Maggie had raised her to be this emotionally tuned in, or if this was something entirely Emily's. Either way, he was grateful. He'd been expecting isolation to become his new normal. And yet, here was Emily, handing him a wish without asking what he'd do with it. He closed his fingers around the stem, not hard enough to crush it, but firmly enough to feel its presence. Maybe it wouldn't cure him, maybe it wouldn't change anything, but it made him feel less alone. They stayed there in silence for a long minute. Then Emily spoke again, softer this time. "Do you think wishes work better if you believe them?" He looked at her and smiled faintly. "Maybe," he said. "Maybe believing is part of the medicine." She seemed satisfied with that answer, though it wasn't really an answer at all. He stood up slowly, the dandelion still in hand. His legs felt heavier, but his chest didn't. Emily turned back toward the garden, toward the rows of trimmed roses, and the woman still humming quietly to herself as she worked. Ethan followed, walking a little behind her, not rushing. It was strange how something so small could reroute an entire moment. He'd walked away to process bad news alone, and came back with a child's kindness clutched in his hand. When Maggie saw them approaching, she gave Ethan a curious glance, but didn't say anything. She simply smiled when Emily sat on the edge of the planter, legs swinging, as if nothing serious had happened. Ethan sat next to her without needing an invitation. He didn't explain the call, and Maggie didn't ask, not then. She glanced at the dandelion in his hand and gave him a soft look, as if acknowledging something without words. Emily began talking about which roses had the strongest thorns, completely unconcerned with adult matters now that her part was done. Ethan let the chatter wash over him, and for once, he didn't try to analyze, solve, or plan. He just existed in the moment, letting it be what it was. His mind wandered briefly to the meetings he had skipped this week, to the stack of unopened messages piling up on his desk, but none of them mattered here. Not right now. Right now, what mattered was a girl who believed in the quiet power of a wish, a mother who trusted silence, and a man holding a dandelion like it was a talisman. And somewhere inside him, the gears of resistance began to slow, just a little. While Maggie trimmed roses in the back garden, Ethan received an urgent call from his oncologist. His voice faltered, and though he tried to walk away, Emily caught enough to understand he was sick. She didn't ask for details, just placed a dandelion in his palm and told him it was for wishing the sickness away. The fragile stem in his hand felt more powerful than the multi-million-dollar deals he had ever closed. The lights went out mid-sentence. Ethan had been reading a document in the study, half distracted, when everything blinked into blackness. At first, he thought it was a fuse, something local, fixable. But when he stepped into the hallway and saw the windows lit only by the occasional flash of lightning, he realized the storm had taken the grid with it. The wind outside had grown heavier by the hour, whipping branches like ribbon, and now it was here, in full. He felt the deep, distant rumble of thunder shake the walls slightly, like a presence knocking just to say, "I'm here." Within moments, he could hear Maggie's voice from the kitchen, calm, not panicked, telling Emily to stay close. He followed the sound until he found them. Maggie gathering candles from the drawers, striking matches with practiced ease, and Emily clutching a book to her chest like it were a safety object. "Power's out everywhere," Maggie said without looking up. "Transformer probably blew. I'll call the company when the lines settle." Ethan nodded but said nothing, standing awkwardly in the doorway, unsure if this situation required his authority or his absence. Maggie lit the first candle and handed it to him. "Come on, let's move somewhere warmer." They relocated to the living room, a space Ethan usually avoided. It had always felt too performative, like a showroom piece meant for guests he never invited. But now, bathed in candlelight, the corners softened. Maggie placed the candles carefully, one on the fireplace mantel, one on the coffee table, another on the piano. The glow revealed parts of the room he hadn't really noticed in years. The photos that remained from a different lifetime, the texture of a throw blanket someone, probably Maggie, had added to the armchair. Emily dropped onto the rug and began arranging cushions like a nest. "We should tell stories," she announced. "Storms are less scary when there's stories." Maggie looked over at Ethan, as if waiting to see whether he would stay or retreat. But something kept him rooted. Maybe it was the flicker of candlelight, or the echo of the doctor's voice still lingering in his chest. Or maybe it was the fact that this room, for once, didn't feel so empty. He sat down at the edge of the sofa, unsure if he belonged, but willing at least to try. Emily tucked herself under a blanket she'd brought from her room, one with little faded stars on it, and patted the cushion beside her. "You sit too," she said, addressing Ethan with the kind of expectation only children possess. He hesitated, then obeyed. As he lowered himself beside her, she leaned slightly against his arm, already comfortable, already at ease. Maggie sat in the nearby chair, legs curled beneath her, a mug of tea balanced in one hand, candlelight dancing in her eyes. "So," Emily began with the tone of someone about to deliver a great epic, "there was once a castle, but not a normal castle. This one floated in the sky. And instead of guards, it had dragons, but the dragons were polite, and they wore little capes." Ethan raised an eyebrow, intrigued despite himself. "Polite dragons?" he asked. "Isn't that a contradiction?" Emily turned to him with mock indignation. "Even dragons deserve good manners," she said. Maggie chuckled, shaking her head, and just like that, the night shifted. The storm still roared outside, but inside the living room they were suspended, untouched for now by whatever waited beyond the candlelight. The story unfolded slowly, with Emily guiding them through flying staircases, mischievous clouds, and a king who loved pickles more than gold. She would pause occasionally to ask Ethan what he thought should happen next, and though he stumbled through the make-believe at first, he eventually leaned in, offering suggestions with a smile that surprised even him. Maggie didn't speak much, but her gaze shifted between the two of them with quiet affection, as if she were watching something form, something she hadn't dared hope for. The lines between them, once so clearly drawn, employer and employee, homeowner and housekeeper, man and child, began to dissolve. Not completely, not permanently, but enough to let in something softer. They weren't playing roles right now. They were just people, weathering a storm with nothing but their company and a handful of candles. Ethan realized somewhere in the middle of Emily's tale that he hadn't thought about work or illness or legacy in over 20 minutes. That small revelation hit him like a breeze through a locked window. He hadn't escaped his reality, but he'd stepped beside it, and that was something. At one point, Emily asked Maggie if she remembered the cloud puzzle part, clearly a reference to a past story they'd once made up together. Maggie played along easily, picking up the thread with a smoothness that made Ethan wonder how often they did this. He felt like a guest in a private world, but they never excluded him. They pulled him in through shared glances, prompts, little jokes that required no backstory. The candlelight flickered and sputtered as the wax burned low, but none of them moved to replace them yet. The storm was still pounding the windows, but it felt more like a background drum now, something that belonged to another place. Emily nestled closer under the blanket, her voice growing quieter as her story reached its end. "And then," she whispered, "the dragons all curled up together in the tallest tower, and they weren't scary anymore because they'd finally found their people." Ethan blinked, wondering if she meant it as metaphor or if it was just the way children wrapped up stories. Either way, it hit a place in him that hadn't been touched in years. After a while, Emily began to fade, her head leaning more heavily against Ethan's arm. Her eyes blinked slower, her words slurring into sleep. Maggie moved to lift her, but Ethan shifted slightly, adjusting so Emily could remain where she was. Maggie paused, caught his eye and gave a small, grateful nod before settling back into her chair. Neither of them spoke. Words would have felt too formal for a moment like this. The storm outside was still present, but its force seemed to have waned. Ethan found himself watching the way Emily's tiny hand clutched a bit of the blanket, how her mouth twitched slightly in dreams. He had never held a child close before, not like this, not with comfort, not with trust. And yet she had curled up beside him like it was the most natural thing in the world. Maggie didn't break the silence, but her gaze remained on the two of them, as if trying to memorize this image. Ethan couldn't blame her. He was doing the same. For the first time since the diagnosis, he wasn't thinking about endings, just presence. Eventually, Maggie stood, gathering the leftover mugs and wax-stripped plates without a word. Ethan stayed still, unwilling to disturb the small weight resting against him. He stared ahead, lost in thought, the flickering candles casting long, irregular shadows on the walls. He wasn't ready to admit what this moment meant, not even to himself, but he knew it mattered. He felt it in the stillness, in the ease, in the absence of roles. Here, there was no agenda, no power imbalance, no expectations. Just connection, the kind that snuck up on you when you weren't looking. The kind that made a man forget how lonely he had been. He watched the last candle gutter slightly, then stabilize. The wind outside pressed against the house once more, but it didn't reach them. Not tonight, not here. When a coastal storm knocked out power, the house plunged into darkness. Maggie lit candles, and they all gathered in the living room. Emily curled up under a blanket beside Ethan, telling stories about imaginary castles. In the flickering light, the distance between employer, employee, and child blurred. For a few hours, they were simply three people sheltering together from the wind. Ethan invited Maggie and Emily to join him for his first chemotherapy session, though he half expected them to decline. It wasn't that he didn't want them there, quite the opposite. He just assumed they'd gently sidestep the invitation out of discomfort or kindness. People usually did. Most didn't want to sit beside someone hooked up to a bag of toxins, watching time pass slowly while hope was administered in milliliters. But when he brought it up over breakfast, voice clipped and casual, Maggie barely hesitated. "Of course we'll come," she said, her tone so matter-of-fact it stunned him. Then Emily, mouth still full of toast, looked up and added, "Will it hurt?" He blinked, unsure how to answer, and Maggie touched Emily's hand gently. "He might feel sick after," she said, "but we'll be there." Emily nodded once, decisive. "Then I'm going." Ethan didn't reply right away. He didn't know how to process being agreed with so easily, so thoroughly. He had spent the week expecting to go alone, imagining how he'd pass the time. Maybe a book, maybe emails, maybe nothing at all. But now, for reasons he didn't fully understand, he felt lighter, knowing they'd be there too. The day of the appointment, the hospital wing was crowded but oddly quiet, like everyone had silently agreed not to break the unspoken pact of that space. No dramatics, no noise, just endurance. Ethan checked in at the front desk, paperwork already filled out. The routine new, but quickly familiar. Maggie and Emily followed closely, the little girl holding her mother's hand, but walking confidently, like this was just another errand. When the nurse called his name, he expected Maggie to hesitate, but she stood immediately. Emily marched beside her, clutching a small tote bag that Ethan hadn't noticed until now. Inside it were markers, crayons, and a worn sketch pad with the corner torn off. The nurse led them to the infusion area, a space lined with recliner chairs and IV poles. It smelled faintly of antiseptic and peppermint, and Ethan was immediately struck by how ordinary it all looked. As he sat down and rolled up his sleeve, Emily climbed onto the chair beside him without asking. She opened her sketchpad, pulled the cap off a green marker with her teeth, and began to draw as though this were perfectly normal. The nurse prepped him gently, explaining the procedure, asking routine questions about medications and allergies. Ethan answered automatically, his voice low. Maggie sat in the corner chair, hands folded, alert but calm. When the IV was inserted and the chemo began to drip, Ethan braced himself for some overwhelming sensation. Pain, fear, a sudden sense of collapse, but nothing came. Just a slow, cold trickle, and the surreal awareness that his life had now been split into a before and after. He looked at Emily, whose feet dangled off the chair, her tongue poking from the corner of her mouth as she concentrated on her drawing. Occasionally she'd glance up at him, as if making sure he was still okay, then returned to her paper. She said nothing for a long time, letting the markers speak for her. Ethan realized he was oddly grateful for the silence. It didn't feel tense, it felt respectful. He looked over at Maggie, and for a brief second their eyes met. She didn't smile. She didn't have to. Her presence, like Emily's, was an anchor in a space where nothing else felt stable. After about 20 minutes, Emily tore the finished drawing from her pad and handed it to Ethan with a proud little grin. "Here," she said, "it's us." He looked down at the page. 3 stick figures, drawn with thick strokes, one tall man in the middle, flanked by a woman and a child, all holding hands. He chuckled genuinely, surprised by the detail. Ethan's figure had a tie. Maggie had a ponytail. Emily had giant round eyes and what looked like a crown. "Why do you have a crown?" he asked. "Because I'm the bravest," she said confidently, "and I drew you smiling." Ethan tilted his head. "Why?" Emily's face grew suddenly serious, her voice quiet but firm. "Because you will again." There was no doubt in her voice, no pause before she spoke. As if it were already true, and he just hadn't caught up to it yet. The simplicity of it made something in his chest twist. He'd sat down expecting to be depleted. Instead, he was being drawn back to life in bright-colored ink and unflinching belief. He stared at the sketch longer than necessary, not because of its artistic value, but because of what it represented. No one had ever drawn him before. No one had taken the time to see him as more than a last name or a business title or a diagnosis. And here was this child, drawing him not as a sick man or a dying man, but as someone still smiling, someone still connected. The simplicity of her art said things he wasn't ready to say himself, that he mattered, that he belonged to someone, that the space between them wasn't just proximity, it was family in the making. He folded the picture carefully, his fingers lingering at the edges. He reached for his wallet, one he hadn't touched much in days, and slipped the drawing inside, right next to the only photo he still carried of his parents. It felt right, like an unspoken rite of passage. The past and the possible, now sitting side by side in his pocket. Maggie saw what he did and nodded once, her expression unreadable but warm. She didn't need to comment. She understood exactly what the gesture meant. The nurse returned, checking his vitals, asking how he felt. "Okay," Ethan replied, and this time he meant it. Not great, not perfect, but okay. The kind of okay that surprised him. The kind that came from not being alone in a sterile room full of strangers. Emily leaned her head against his arm, not quite tired, but not fully alert anymore. Maggie was reading something on her phone now, but her other hand rested on Emily's back gently, always aware. Ethan looked around at the other chairs, other patients, some alone, some not. Most were staring into the middle distance. None of them, as far as he could tell, were being drawn in crayon by a little girl in a crown. He felt, for a rare moment, like the luckiest man in the room. Not because of his prognosis, not because of wealth or status, but because of who had shown up. Because of who had stayed. Because of who believed in his smile before he did. When the session ended and the IV line was removed, Ethan stood a little slower than usual, not from weakness, but from reflection. Emily skipped ahead of him toward the lobby, humming something tuneless but cheerful. Maggie walked beside him, holding his coat without asking, her presence as steady as ever. He looked down at the drawing again once they got to the parking lot, unfolded it, and studied it in the harsh light of day. It held something that couldn't be explained in reports or medical files. It held belief, not in medicine, but in him. He folded it once more, placed it back into his wallet, and closed it with care. He didn't speak during the drive home, and neither did they. But the silence was full, not empty, full of understanding, full of shared ground, full of something rare. Ethan invited Maggie and Emily to join him for his first chemotherapy session, though he half expected them to decline. Emily insisted on coming, settling in beside him with a sketch pad. She drew the three of them as stick figures holding hands. When Ethan asked why she'd drawn him smiling, she replied, "Because you will again." He tucked the picture into his wallet, next to the only photo he had of his late parents. Late one night, Ethan found himself drafting a will. It had been coming for weeks, recommended by his doctor, echoed by his lawyer, and now unavoidable. The template was already prepared, clinical and cold, full of clauses and contingencies. His name was typed at the top in bold font, like a brand stamped on a document that felt more like an obituary than a plan. He sat at his desk, the cursor blinking at him like a silent dare. The phrases felt wrong as soon as he began typing, "To whom it may concern, I, Ethan Charles Cole, being of sound mind." Sound mind. That part felt like a joke. What was a sound mind to a man who had built empires but couldn't stop a cluster of rogue cells from rewriting his fate? He reread the first paragraph twice, then leaned back in his chair, dissatisfied. The language was hollow. Yes, it covered the basics. Assets, holdings, property. But it said nothing about who he was. Nothing about the life he'd led, or the life he had just begun to understand because of a girl who drew him smiling when he couldn't remember the last time he had. He stared at the monitor, fingers hovering over the keyboard, and then he made a decision without fully realizing he'd made it. He minimized the will and opened a blank document. No formatting, no templates, no legal speak. Just a blinking line and a quiet room. He started typing. "Dear Emily," he wrote. He paused, his chest tightening, then continued slowly at first. "I don't know when you'll read this. Maybe when you're older, maybe after I'm gone, maybe never, if I have any say. But I needed to tell you about the man I was before you came into my life, and the man I've become since." The words came easier now, not with polish or structure, but with truth. He wrote about the person he had been, driven, guarded, efficient. A man who'd traded connection for achievement, who had built walls to feel safe inside his own loneliness. He confessed that he had once believed solitude was strength and that emotions were liabilities. He told her that for years he had avoided people not because he didn't care, but because caring had never felt safe. As he wrote, the memories came uninvited, sitting alone in his study with the diagnosis clutched in his hands. The first night he cried, and she wiped the tear he hadn't meant to show, the pancakes at dawn, the storm where they told stories by candlelight. He described how she had shifted something in him without even trying, how she had made space in his heart where there had only been steel. "You reminded me that there is still softness in the world," he typed, "and that letting people in isn't the same as losing control. You gave me that truth without asking for anything in return." He didn't dress it up with metaphors or poetry. It was raw, and in that rawness, it became the most honest thing he had ever written. He wrote for over an hour, stopping only to breathe through the harder parts. He told her about his sister and the piano, about his parents and their distance, about the emptiness that came with success when it wasn't shared with anyone. And then, without planning it, he wrote something he hadn't said out loud yet. "I love you like you're mine." The moment he typed it, something in his chest broke and settled at the same time. He stared at those 7 words, reread them, and didn't delete a single one. He wasn't trying to impress anyone with this letter. It wasn't for public record. It wasn't for courts or lawyers or legacy managers. It was for her, for Emily. A girl who had walked into his life holding nothing but curiosity and crayons, and who had somehow redrawn every part of him that mattered. He ended the letter simply, "Thank you for making me feel like I wasn't just dying, but finally living." He saved it, printed it, and sat for several minutes watching the paper slide from the printer like it carried more weight than its size could explain. He didn't put it in an envelope. He didn't sign it. He just held it, read it again, and felt something inside loosen, something that had been clenched for too long. He considered giving it to her then, walking down the hall, placing it in her tiny hands and saying, "Here, this is yours." But it didn't feel right. Not yet. Not while they were still in the middle of the story. She wouldn't understand the full meaning, and he didn't want to burden her with adult thoughts too early. She'd given him her belief, her trust, her joy. He wanted her to keep all of that, untainted by what he feared was coming. So instead, he stood up, tucked the letter under his arm, and walked to the one room in the house that felt like a bridge between them. The piano room. The space she'd breathed life into again with her presence, her questions, her belief that every house needed music. He stepped inside, the light low, the air still holding the faint scent of old varnish and new possibility. He knelt beside the bench and slid the letter beneath the piano lid, just far enough that it wouldn't be seen unless someone went looking, but close enough that one day she would find it. He sat on the bench for a moment afterward, not to play, not even to touch the keys, but just to be still in the space they'd shared. He pictured her finding the letter one day, maybe in a few years, maybe long after he was gone. He imagined her reading it, understanding more with each sentence, not because he needed her to remember him, but because he needed her to know what she had done for him, that she had mattered, that she had changed a man who believed he was already set in stone, that she had softened something he thought unbreakable. He didn't know if she would cry or smile or fold it into a drawer the way he had done with her sketch, but he hoped, above all else, that it would reach her heart the way her simple gestures had reached his, that it would tell her what he couldn't say aloud yet, that he had seen her, that he had loved her for it. As he walked back through the hallway, something had shifted in his body. The weight he'd carried since the diagnosis, the quiet pressure in his chest that no medication could ease, felt lighter, not gone, but bearable. The act of writing the letter hadn't changed the prognosis or solved any practical problems, but it had marked a moment, a choice, a shift from silence to honesty. He passed the study where his laptop still sat open, the legal will untouched and unfinished, and he didn't feel guilty for abandoning it. That document could wait. It would be done soon, he was sure. But this, what he had just written, felt more important. This was the real will, the legacy that mattered, and he didn't need a notary or a court to validate it. Late one night, Ethan found himself drafting a will. The sterile legal language felt wrong, so he began writing a letter to Emily instead, explaining who he was before they met and how she had changed him. He never gave it to her, but he left it in the piano room, where she would one day find it. The act of writing it lifted a weight he hadn't known he was carrying. Emily's 9th birthday arrived, and Ethan surprised her with a modest party in the West Wing, now cleaned and alive with music from a rented upright piano. It had taken weeks of preparation, not because the party was elaborate, but because reclaiming that part of the house meant more than dusting furniture and tuning keys. It meant revisiting memories he had once sealed away behind locked doors and forgotten habits. But as the day approached, he found himself not only willing, but eager to bring life back into that space. For her, he hadn't told Maggie or Emily what he'd planned. He simply asked Maggie to keep Emily busy for a few hours while the delivery truck arrived, with balloons, a cake from a local bakery, and the small, upright piano he'd arranged to be brought in that morning. The staff had quietly helped him clear the furniture and open the windows. The scent of polish still lingered faintly, but now it mixed with frosting and laughter. When Maggie and Emily walked in and saw the room lit with soft decorations and a bright "Happy Birthday" banner stretching across the window frame, Emily froze mid-step, her mouth open. Then she turned to Ethan and whispered, stunned, "Is this for me?" Ethan nodded, his hands tucked in his pockets, trying to hide how nervous he felt. "I figured the West Wing deserved some music today," he said, managing a half smile. Emily didn't run to the gifts or the cake. She ran to the piano. Her fingers grazed the keys like it was a treasure she hadn't dared hope for. "Does it work?" she asked. "Try it and see," Ethan replied. She sat down, pressed a note, and grinned when it chimed back softly but clearly. Maggie, standing a few steps behind, brought her hand to her mouth, overwhelmed not just by the gesture but by what it meant. She glanced around the room, the cleaned rugs, the care in every small detail, and her eyes landed on Ethan. "You did all this?" she asked quietly. He shrugged, uncomfortable with praise. "She's only 9 once." Emily had already begun making up a song, something off-key and improvised, but joyful. She started to hum along, completely absorbed. "It's the best piano ever," she declared. Ethan chuckled. "Don't tell the rental company. They'll think I stole it." Emily laughed, and Maggie did too, and suddenly the room felt like it belonged to the present, not the past. As the afternoon wore on, the small group they had invited, just 2 of Emily's school friends, their parents, and one neighbor who often helped Maggie with groceries, gathered around. There were no clowns or bounce houses, just sandwiches, cupcakes, and a playlist Ethan had curated himself from songs Maggie once mentioned Emily liked. He had stayed up 2 nights reading articles about kid-friendly party ideas and looking for the right mix between celebration and simplicity. The sound of children laughing, the occasional discordant note from the piano, and the smell of vanilla icing did more to revive the house than any renovation ever had. Ethan kept to the edges mostly, content to watch. But every so often, Emily would run over to pull him in, a game, a dance, a request to lift her up so she could touch the top of the window frame. "I bet you were tall even when you were 9, she told him once, and he laughed, admitting he was mostly legs and elbows. Maggie watched them with an expression that held more than words could say: pride, gratitude, and something deeper. Not just appreciation for the party, but recognition of the man who had changed right before her eyes. When it was time for cake, everyone gathered around the long table. The lights were dimmed slightly, and the candles flickered atop a small chocolate cake with pastel sprinkles. Maggie stood behind her daughter, hands resting gently on her shoulders. Ethan held the lighter, offering it to Emily with a theatrical bow. "Would you like to do the honors?" he asked. Emily giggled, shaking her head. "You light them, I'll blow them out." As the candles flamed to life, Ethan looked around the room again, at the smiling faces, the warmth in the air, and the sound of people being truly present. It hit him then that this was the first birthday he'd attended in over a decade that wasn't corporate, obligatory, or formal. This wasn't about networking or status, it was about presence. Emily took a deep breath and looked around. "Can I make a wish now?" she asked. Everyone nodded, a collective hush falling. She closed her eyes, smiled to herself, and then blew the candles out in one steady breath. Applause broke out, light and spontaneous, but Ethan remained quiet, watching her closely. Something about her wish, the way she held it, made him curious. Later, as the party quieted and the guests trickled out, Ethan found Emily sitting on the piano bench, swinging her legs. Maggie was clearing dishes nearby. He sat beside her, not speaking at first. She looked at him, then asked, "Do grown-ups still make birthday wishes?" He considered the question. "Some do. Some stop when they stop believing." Emily tilted her head. "Did you stop believing?" He exhaled slowly. "For a while, yeah, but maybe not anymore." She smiled and looked down at her hands. "I wished for more days like this," she said, her voice quiet, honest. Not excited or dramatic. Just truth. Ethan blinked, caught off guard. "Not more birthdays?" She shook her head. "No, just more days where everyone's happy. Together." He felt something shift in his chest, not pain, not sadness, something quieter and more profound. Connection. He didn't respond with words. He just reached out and rested his hand gently over hers. Maggie, overhearing from across the room, paused for a moment, then continued cleaning, a small smile tugging at her lips. Emily stood and walked to the corner where her sketchpad sat. She brought it back to the piano and opened to a blank page. "I'm going to draw today," she said. Ethan leaned over. "What part?" She grinned. "All of it." He watched as she began sketching the banner, then the cake, then small figures he recognized immediately. Stick versions of herself, her mother, and him, all holding hands again. Maggie joined them a few minutes later and sat on the armrest of the piano bench. "She's going to run out of pages soon," she said softly. "Then we'll buy her another book," Ethan replied. His voice was casual, but his eyes remained fixed on the drawing. He didn't want to forget it. The feeling of this room, this moment, this unexpected peace. He had never associated birthdays with comfort before. They had always been markers of loss, reminders of aging, of absence. But now, for the first time, he saw how a birthday could be something else entirely. A celebration not just of the person born, but of the people who stayed. Maggie's eyes shone as she watched her daughter blow out candles. When Emily wished for more days like this, Ethan realized she wasn't talking about the cake or gifts, but the togetherness. Maggie's phone rang late. Emily was in the ER with a high fever. She answered on the second ring, voice still caught between sleep and panic. The nurse on the line was calm but direct. Emily's temperature had spiked to 104, and they were administering fluids. Maggie hadn't even thrown on shoes before grabbing her purse and keys. But before she could even reach the front door, she found Ethan already there, jacket in hand, car keys clenched, his face pale but focused. "I'll drive," he said simply. She didn't ask how he knew. She didn't question it. In that moment, it didn't matter how he'd found out or why he was standing in her doorway at midnight. What mattered was that he was there. The car ride to the hospital was mostly silent, broken only by the occasional update from Maggie reading the latest text from the ER nurse. Ethan's grip on the steering wheel was white-knuckled. He didn't speak, but his silence wasn't distant. It was controlled, protective. By the time they reached the hospital's entrance, Maggie had barely unbuckled her seatbelt. before Ethan was out of the car, opening her door and walking with her through the automatic glass doors as if it were the only place in the world he could be. Emily was already resting in a room when they arrived, the IV drip slowly feeding antibiotics into her arm, her cheeks flushed and damp with sweat. Maggie spoke with the nurse while Ethan moved quietly to the side of the hospital bed. He didn't say anything. He just looked at her, really looked, in a way that caught him off guard. Emily seemed smaller in the hospital gown, her curls matted against her forehead, her usually vibrant energy dimmed by fever. Her breathing was uneven, not labored, but rapid in a way that made his chest tighten. He pulled a chair close and sat down, carefully taking her hand in his. She didn't flinch. Even in sleep, her fingers curled loosely around his. Maggie stepped into the room, her eyes tired and wide at the same time. Ethan looked up, silently asking the question she already knew he would. Is she going to be okay? Maggie gave a soft nod, the kind meant more to reassure than to confirm. They said the meds are kicking in. We just have to let her rest, she murmured. He nodded and turned his gaze back to Emily, as if watching her breathe was the only thing anchoring him. Hours passed like minutes and decades at once. Ethan barely moved. Nurses came and went, checking vitals, adjusting machines. But he remained in the same position, Emily's small hand wrapped in his larger one. Occasionally, Maggie urged him to take a break, stretch, get some water, but he just shook his head. I'm fine here, he said each time, and he meant it. Leaving that chair felt impossible. He'd never been good at waiting. He built his life on control, results, execution. But this wasn't a negotiation. This was presence, and somehow that was enough. Around 3 a.m., Maggie finally gave in to exhaustion and curled into the corner chair, shoes off, knees pulled to her chest. She was asleep within minutes, her body sagging with the kind of fatigue that only mothers knew. Ethan glanced at her, quietly grateful for her trust. Then he looked back at Emily, still warm under the thin blanket, her breathing starting to slow to something closer to normal. Ethan couldn't remember the last time he stayed up all night for someone else. Business trips, late-night strategy meetings, board crises, those were obligations. This wasn't. This was choice. And that realization sat heavy and humbling in his chest. He didn't feel heroic or particularly strong. He felt necessary, not needed out of convenience, but needed in a way that stripped down everything superficial about who he'd once been. Here, there was no room for titles or reputation. Just this room, this moment, this girl whose world had wrapped itself around his without permission. He leaned closer, whispering more to himself than to her. You're okay, Emily, just rest. She stirred slightly, her fingers tightening for a moment around his, and then relaxing again. He closed his eyes briefly, not to sleep, but to feel what this meant. It wasn't panic, it wasn't dread. It was clarity, sharp and sudden and terrifying in its simplicity. He couldn't imagine a world without her in it. Not anymore. At some point near dawn, Emily shifted under the covers and murmured something, soft, slurred, the kind of words that live between dream and waking. Ethan leaned in, unsure if she was calling for her mum or just rambling through fevered sleep. But then he heard it clearly, even through the haze. Don't go, Ethan. It wasn't loud, it wasn't desperate. It was gentle and certain, like a truth her subconscious already knew. He froze, the words hitting him with a weight he hadn't braced for. Not because she said his name, but because of what it meant. She expected him to stay, she wanted him to stay. And not just in the hospital room, but in her life. He didn't speak, didn't promise anything aloud, but in his heart something clicked into place. A silent vow. He wasn't going anywhere. When Maggie woke an hour later, sunlight bleeding faintly through the blinds, she found him exactly where she'd left him, still at Emily's side, still holding her hand. He looked up at her, eyes tired but clear. Maggie approached quietly and rested a hand on his shoulder, a silent thank you passing between them. She didn't ask him to leave. She didn't even suggest he take a break. She just sat in the chair beside him and leaned her head back, trusting him with her daughter's comfort. It was the kind of trust that didn't need to be spoken, and he felt it deeply. Eventually, a nurse entered and gently checked Emily's vitals again. Her temperature had dropped. She was still resting, but her coloring had improved. Maggie smiled softly, relief flooding her features. Ethan let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding for hours. It was the kind of breath that changed something in a man. Not just relief, but belonging. As they sat there in the quiet, the hum of the hospital fading into the background, Ethan found himself thinking about what came next. Not in the abstract, not in terms of prognosis or business, but in terms of proximity, of presence. He imagined school drop-offs, piano recitals, more late-night pancakes. He imagined laughter in the kitchen and stories in the storm and birthdays that weren't his, but still felt like they were. He didn't know if he had 5 months or 5 years left, but he knew what he wanted to do with every minute of it. He didn't want to just survive. He wanted to stay, to be part of something that had already made him more whole than anything he'd built alone. This wasn't about obligation or charity or even love in the romantic sense. This was about roots, about permanence, about being claimed and claiming back. As Emily slept, she whispered in her dreams, "Don't go, Ethan." He realized he couldn't imagine a life where he wasn't part of theirs. Months later, scans brought cautious hope. Remission was possible. Ethan sat in the oncologist's office, Maggie beside him, her hand resting lightly on his knee. Dr. Naylor's voice was steady, measured, but there was a current of optimism under his clinical tone. The tumor markers had dropped significantly. The chemotherapy, though exhausting, had done its work. There were no guarantees, there never would be, but there was room now for a word Ethan hadn't dared to entertain before. Remission, not certainty, not cure, but possibility. Maggie squeezed his hand once, her grip firm, and Ethan didn't speak for a full minute. He just nodded, emotion lodged firmly in his throat. When they walked back to the car, he didn't turn on the engine right away. Instead, he sat quietly, both hands on the steering wheel, staring out at nothing. Maggie watched him, then reached over to rest her head on his shoulder. No words, just presence. And for the first time since this began, he let himself believe that there might still be a future not defined by fear or expiration dates. A future with mornings, music, routines, and them. He spent the following days thinking about what that future looked like, not in grand gestures, but in small, deliberate ones. He thought about spaces, literal rooms that had once belonged to him alone. Rooms he had locked both physically and emotionally, keeping people out for the sake of control. The master study was one of them. Since inheriting the estate, he had kept that space closed. It was where his father used to work, where Ethan first learned to sit still and remain silent. The room reeked of legacy and expectations, a shrine to the man Ethan had once tried so hard to emulate and then spent years trying not to become. But now, something in him had shifted. His world no longer revolved around boardrooms or public perception. His sense of success wasn't tied to acquisitions or quarterly wins. It had narrowed to something deeper, quieter, connection, shared breakfasts, candlelit storms, crayon drawings, laughter echoing through reopened hallways. He thought about Emily's words, how every house needed music, and realized she had taught him more about building a life than any mentor he'd ever had. That morning he woke early. The sun had barely warmed the windows, but he felt unusually rested. He walked down the hallway barefoot, stopping briefly in front of the study door. He touched the knob, then opened it for the first time in years. Dust had settled on the furniture, but the room itself was untouched. It had waited for this moment. He entered quietly, like he was stepping into a sacred space, not out of reverence, but out of respect for who he used to be. He placed 2 keys on the old mahogany desk, one silver, one gold, and stood for a moment, considering what it meant to give them away. Later that morning, after breakfast, he found Maggie and Emily in the kitchen. Emily was trying to make toast without burning it. Maggie was laughing at her daughter's frustration. Ethan stepped in, clearing his throat softly. "I want to show you both something," he said. They followed him without question. Emily skipped ahead. Maggie kept pace with quiet curiosity. When they reached the door to the study, Ethan turned to them and held out the keys. "This house is yours as much as mine now," he said. Emily blinked at him, clearly confused at first. "You're giving us keys?" she asked, her head tilting the way it always did when she was trying to make sense of adult logic. Ethan nodded. "To the rooms I used to keep shut, to all of it. You belong here. Both of you. And it's time the house showed that too." Maggie's breath caught, and for a moment she didn't speak. Her eyes shimmered, but she let Emily respond first. The girl took both keys with careful fingers, as if they might melt in her hands, and then she did something Ethan didn't expect. She stepped forward and threw her arms around him with more force than her small frame should have allowed. "You're my bonus dad now," she declared into his chest. "Okay?" Ethan froze, overwhelmed, then slowly brought his arms around her, holding her tighter than he meant to. He felt something in him unravel, something old, guarded and quiet, and he let it. Maggie watched them, silent, but her expression said everything. Gratitude, relief, and something that looked very much like love. They spent the rest of the morning in the study together. Emily explored the drawers like they held treasure. Maggie dusted off shelves, asking gentle questions about the books and items that filled the room. Ethan answered them, sometimes with stories, sometimes just with a shrug. He didn't feel the need to impress them. He just wanted to be known, and they listened, not to the man he was on paper, but to the man who had shared birthday cake, held fevered hands, and made room in his life for a family he didn't know he needed. Emily eventually sat at the desk and began sketching again, this time drawing the study with all 3 of them in it. "It's different now," she said, pointing to the drawing. "It doesn't look lonely anymore." Ethan didn't reply. He couldn't. His throat was tight with emotion. Instead, he rested a hand on her back and simply stayed there, letting the moment be what it was. Real, simple, full. That afternoon, as they opened more forgotten spaces in the house, old storage rooms, unused guest suites, corners Ethan hadn't seen in years, it felt less like a symbolic gesture and more like a literal one. They weren't just making room for Maggie and Emily. They were filling the house with new stories, rewriting the silence. Every laugh, every question, every step across creaky floorboards redefined what the Cole estate was and who it belonged to. Ethan watched Maggie show Emily how to fold linens from a closet he hadn't opened since he was a teenager, and for a moment, he felt like a child again. Not in a regressive way, but in a clean slate way, like he'd been allowed to start over. He realized then that family wasn't just something you inherited. It was something you built, choice by choice, word by word, until one day you looked around and saw a life that was no longer just yours, but shared. Ethan knew that his name would still live on in buildings and investments and contracts long after he was gone. But for the first time in his life, he didn't care if that was how people remembered him. Those legacies were hollow if they weren't backed by something human. What mattered to him now were the small, invisible things. The way Emily grabbed his hand without hesitation, the way Maggie trusted him without condition, the way the house no longer echoed, but responded. He had spent so many years believing that power meant independence, that solitude was strength, but these quiet, tender moments had taught him something radical, that the heart wasn't a vault to be guarded. It was a room to be opened, lived in, shared. On a sunlit morning, Ethan led Maggie and Emily to the once-locked master study and handed them keys. "This house is yours as much as mine now," he said. Emily hugged him fiercely, declaring him her bonus dad. In that moment, Ethan understood that his legacy would not be measured in skyscrapers or bank accounts, but in the unbreakable bond forged in quiet kitchens, storm-lit living rooms, and hospital chairs. The walls around his heart had finally fallen, and in their place was a home. We pour our hearts into every story we share here. It's not just about the script, it's about connecting with you. If this story moved you even just a little, consider subscribing to our channel. That small click helps us continue creating meaningful stories like this one. We're a growing community that believes in the power of emotion, memory, and human connection. We'd love to hear from you. What part of this story spoke to you the most? Drop a comment below, explore the other stories we've shared, and know that your voice matters here. Thank you for being with us, and we truly hope to see you in the next video.